In parentheses, I would like to say something about biennales and art fairs. Again, a thing that came up for much discussion in our meetings. There is a lot of cynicism out there these days about how biennales are essentially just like art fairs, only maybe the art fairs are a little bit more gaudy and biennales a little bit more sober. They're everything not like art fairs. An art fair is a bazaar in which a whole series of vendors, no problem with vendors, that's their job, and artists need them, a series of vendors get together to make a composite event in which people can get ready access to what it is that they have on offer. The Biennale is an exhibition. It is not a bazaar. And a good Biennale has however many works it may contain, however diverse they may be, and however they may actually overlap name by name by name with certain art fairs. A Biennale has a point. It has a point of view at very least. The Biennales present to a general viewer a view of the contemporary work and sometimes of the historical work that the curator or curators feel is germane. Art fairs are kept alive by people who actually buy the stuff. Biennales are kept alive by people who pay for the tickets. They are subsidized by municipalities, they are subsidized by governments, they are subsidized by a host of people, but the focus of the Biennale is on the visitor, whereas the focus of the art fair is the customer. The visitor may not buy anything and may not even be able to afford the catalog, whereas at an art fair, this is not the case. Now, in our discussions, there was a good deal of mention of how art fairs have morphed and now have curated exhibitions and have seminar programs and all of this. I frankly think this is fine, and Kay Sophie Rabinowitz, who has just been through this experience with Basel, said some very interesting things about what she had tried to do there in order to open up this structure and make it more focused on the art and, again, on dialogue. That said, if art fairs move in the direction of biennales, it's fine with me. What biennales can never do is move in the opposite direction. Biennales cannot be viewed and cannot allow themselves to be viewed as just another venue where artists or their representatives put things up for public view in order that they leave out the back door at the end of the show. Now, there's a lot of cynicism in among our own ranks, that is to say under curatorial ranks, about this. Some time ago, I was in New York and saw a colleague, and she said to me, "Oh, I'll see you soon at the art fair in Venice." She meant the Biennale. There are even some members of our community who write in the art press, cynically, about all the boats that show up in Venice, or all the parties in other places that go on in biennales, but they don't talk about the general audience. They are fixated, and at the same time in a love-hate relationship with the moneyed people, and I have, again, no intrinsic objection to that at all, and then don't, in fact, take seriously the viewer, the person with whom the art is impossibly in dialogue. We may lose a lot of art fairs as well as a lot of biennales, and we should consider these losses as serious, but if we lose art fairs, it doesn't grieve me greatly if we lose biennales, particularly the most interesting ones often being the ones with the least support in the most interesting places where culture is fermenting, like Istanbul, Havana, Johannesburg, which we've already lost, and others. If we lose those, it seems to me, it is not just we as in our community who've lost something. Much more importantly, it is the people in those localities for whom these are the pipelines for visual culture. They can buy books, they can rent DVDs, they can get records, they can do everything else. But in the case of the visual arts, there is no secondhand version. The auratic factor is the essence of everything. And again, if we talk about dialogue, it is the way in which dialogue happens in the first person. Let me just do this, by the way. This is the room of Odili Dano-Odita in the Biennale, and straight ahead is the work of Zigmar Polka, and then this is a meeting between Ellsworth Kelly and Odili Dano-Odita, and then this is Ellsworth's room. This is a case where literally artists who had never met converged and entered into conversation, where the works entered into conversation because the progression from room to room meant that you had to constantly readjust what you saw in light of what you were about to see or in light of what you remembered. And let me just give you an idea of what this is Ellsworth Kelly looking at Gerhard Richter. Of course, he looks at paintings of Gerhard Richter, but he doesn't often meet Gerhard Richter. This is Ellsworth Kelly in dialogue with Daniel Buren. There are people in the critical community who speak of Daniel Buren and the conceptual art as if it would have no truck whatsoever with a mere painter, an antiquated practitioner of an old and conservative medium. It didn't seem that Daniel was having any problems whatsoever talking to Ellsworth, and that actually Lawrence Weiner, who was at the front of the exhibition, adores Ellsworth's work and said so publicly in front of a lot of people when he saw him and met him on the stage. This is Valtercio Caldas, an artist from Brazil, a conceptual artist from Brazil, talking with Ellsworth Kelly. This is Zygmunt Polka talking with Ellsworth Kelly. They inhabit different artistic worlds, but they are genuinely engaged with one another. This is Sophie Calle talking to Ellsworth Kelly. And this is one of my favorites. This is the work of Sherry Samba. Sherry Samba is a painter from Congo who is a self-styled painter of popular images, which is to say he makes work out of an idiom which comes from sign painting and comes from political painting of a public nature. In this particular painting, you see the artist sitting in the middle of a group of works, and I can't do it very effectively up here, but there is, from the left on the top, Picasso, Miro, Keith Haring. On the right, there is Miro again. Back is a tantric figure. On the bottom is Magritte. Then there's one of Sherry Samba's own works. Then there's Jean-Michel Basquiat. Ellsworth Kelly's hand is landing on Barnett Newman, and I forget what's hidden behind there, but something of the same nature. This is a case where an African artist puts himself in the middle of world culture. Now, in this way, he did it pictorially in defiance of the fact that usually he is not put in the middle of world culture. Usually he's put in a special box, as all others are when they are brought into exhibitions which are of this particular nature by and large. But in this particular case, you actually have Samba talking with the neighbor to the other side in the next room, who is Ellsworth Kelly. And Ellsworth Kelly, having been a GI in France at the liberation of France, speaks French. And Samba, having come from a former Belgian colony, speaks French. And so in this particular case, you have two artists of utterly different orientations, different backgrounds, speaking quite literally a lingua franca about their work. And unfortunately, I don't have the slide in the group that I brought with me, but there's a very nice photograph of Sherry Samba reconnoitering Ellsworth Kelly's room by himself and looking at Ellsworth Kelly's monochrome abstractions. And this is back to Samba's own work. Now, as I said, there are many, many biennales of this nature, and each one of them has a particular characteristic. One of the things that all of us agreed in this conference was that situation is opportunity. This situation is very often the defining characteristic of good biennales. That for all the hand-wringing that goes on about the homogenization of culture, the globalizing of culture through markets and so on and so forth, biennales are actually one of the places where the counter tendency is in evidence. If markets markets and art markets included, tend to become more and more homogeneous as a result of a sort of collectivized process taste, very often the primary efforts of biennale curators is to note differences and to stress them and to make something out of them. In Havana, for example, the Havana Biennale was created in part to emphasize artists who came from what was then called third world countries, particularly artists who came from countries that were within, if not the socialist side of the equation, at least in countries which were not wholeheartedly allied with the dominant Western powers in the world. And this was a place where artists from Africa, for example, and from other parts of Latin America could be seen together. Istanbul is one of the only biennales other than Sharjah which takes place in the Islamic world. Obviously now with Shanghai and others, we have biennales in parts of Asia which are full of activity and where the cultural definition of that place is in the process of happening, and where at the same time those who see those exhibitions from outside will see that identity, will see those processes working themselves out. The one I know best is Sao Paulo, and Sao Paulo in this way being the third great biennale, historically speaking, I can speak of with a little bit more authority. For many, many years, Latin American artists would go to New York or to Paris predominantly, or maybe to Spain, and develop their careers. They would develop their careers in Latin American countries to the extent that was possible, but usually found that there was a glass ceiling or worse. Very often, there was worse in the form of actual repression from governments that were authoritarian. Latin American artists, if they met one another, tended to meet one another someplace else than their own world. Again, they would meet at parties in Paris, they would meet at parties in New York, and so on. When the Sao Paulo Biennale was created in 1951, at a time when Brazil was going through one of its first great sort of turns of the wheel as a modernizing nation, and was cited in buildings by Oscar Niemeyer, which are declaratively modern and grand and wonderful, it meant that for the first time, artists from the continent in Latin America could converge on a central point and meet each other in something like their own region. So that artists from Caracas could meet artists from Buenos Aires, could meet artists from Sao Paulo, could meet artists from Montevideo, etc., etc., etc. This is the first model for what now has become an increasingly common kind of biennale in the wider world. And the perception that is often conveyed by the art press, which is in fact centered in Europe and America, is that all of these things are simply epigons of the European and American art world. But the good biennales, in fact, are not of that nature. And if there is a fight to keep them from becoming of that nature, it is a fight carried on by serious biennale curators who take real account of where they are, do real efforts to find the artists that are local, make serious efforts to correlate or coordinate those local artists with ones belonging to something like the same kind of cultural milieu, and then, and only then, shaking and baking with a variety of other artists. Now, I did say that there are opportunities here. There are also opportunists wherever there are opportunities, and there are indeed some of our number who simply make the same show everywhere and then adapt their speech to the locality. But the good shows are the ones where actual work is done to investigate, explore, and to try and come up with combinations one would not have otherwise seen. I'm going to kind of round it out because I think the best thing to do is have some dialogue at a certain point. But having said that there are all these different configurations, the central focus of all biennales should, regardless of what the predicate for them was in their economic or political environment, be the general public. I will go back to the Sao Paulo Biennale example. Paolo Herkenhoff, who is a very good friend of mine and a colleague of mine, was responsible for the 1998 Sao Paulo Biennale. Paolo Herkenhoff, incidentally, comes from a family that had no grand means whatsoever. He is entirely familiar with the actual life of people who have limited resources. If he has been able to travel, it is by virtue of his talent and his seriousness, but he does not in the least take it for granted. So when he did his Biennale, he didn't just make a wonderful exhibition for consumption of tourism and for validation of Sao Paulo in its current incarnation as a powerful economic and cultural center. He did it with in mind educational projects that touched, I forget what the number is, but millions, literally, of school children, of adults, and others. He took the Biennale as the site to bring people to in order to show them the things that they had not seen, could not see by any other means. In his particular case, he did something that Carolyn has done here very well, I think, which is to use the Biennale as a structure for doing some museological things in relation to some things that are all about contemporary production, commissions, experimentation, the unknown, the unseen, the previously unimagined. If Carolyn in this exhibition has put together a very interesting configuration of conceptually oriented works from a lot of different places as a kind of sketch, a map of what is further out there. In the case of Paolo Herkenhoff's Biennale, for the first time ever, he brought real Malevich paintings to a public venue in Latin America. He brought back paintings by artists that belonged in the situation. So, for example, he exhibited some installation works, some pioneering installation works by Lucio Fontana, who is known as an Italian artist, but is actually an Argentine artist from Rosario. He put together a whole set and combination of works such that a person coming to that Biennale could have what amounted to a crash course of direct experience with works of art, after which, when they read the art magazines or read opinions or did whatever they would do in their sort of extended discourses, dialogues, would actually have their own sense of what these things were. And over the course of the years, the Biennale in Sao Paulo has done this repeatedly. Now, this is not perhaps the best model for other biennales. When I did my exhibition, this is Robert Ryman, this is Rainer Genau, When I did my exhibition in Venice, I deliberately avoided creating any kind of historical section for a couple of reasons. One of them, by the way, is that I'm opposed to the idea that the art world is some kind of family with grandmothers, grandfathers, fathers and mothers, and so on and so forth. That the tendency has been in some shows to include elders who seem to be influential, who seem to be the overriding, presiding patriarchal or matriarchal figures for the younger artists. Now, most younger artists bridle at this kind of thing, but lo and behold, the older artists do too. Older artists don't like being treated as the elders. Older artists like Ellsworth Kelly, like Louise Bourgeois, like Sigmar Polke, who's not that old, but he's getting on, those artists would like to be competitive with younger artists. They do not want to be put into Valhalla a little bit too soon. And indeed, what happened in my Biennale was, having invited them not as the elders of their tribes, but as the contemporaries of other people who were half their age, and that their sense of reality was every bit as real and actual as that of younger people, but with different information and different life experience, different ambitions, etc., etc., that under those circumstances you create a present tense which is competitive among people who are not coevals. That's an interesting proposition, but it's a different circumstance because in Venice it's futile to bring history to Venice. It's got more than it knows what to do with. So I used the saturation of history in Venice as a way to lean in the other direction. But that formula would be entirely inappropriate in other places, for example, Sao Paulo, as the experience of Paula Herkenhoff proved. There are many other things that could be said. I guess the basic thing is the following, that cynicism about biennales breeds cynicism within the public. That people who say, oh, we've seen that before, are speaking perhaps for themselves, but probably not for 90% of the people who will see an exhibition. And it is the height of arrogance, particularly from people who protest or pretend to be democratic, radicals, what have you, to deny other people the experience firsthand of works of art because they, with their tickets and their educations and their privileges, have seen them too many times. It is the height of arrogance to talk at those people before those people have had the possibility to see works of art and not know what they think. Actually, Bill Henson said something very good in the press today in response to the furor over his images, and he said, the great thing about art is that it stresses the ambiguity of one's response. One does not know what to think. In a world where there are so many professors, curators, critics, all the people who are interpreters of art, one of the biggest problems is to get us to shut up. One of the biggest problems is to get us to put work in the path of people who have resources of their own, who have desires of their own, who have needs of their own in relation to art, although perhaps they're unaware of them until they encounter it, and to let the first experience of art be precisely the disorienting experience of not knowing what you're dealing with. To take that away from people by a discourse, which is not a dialogue, to take that away from people by an education, which is not in fact an education, but it's an indoctrination, to take that away from people is highly anti-democratic. And one of the things that biennales do, as I say, is to create, out of circumstances which are very often not democratic, it is a government which wishes to say, we are here in the world. It is a series of people in the cultural sphere who want to flex their muscles. Maybe they have good muscles, but the purpose is to flex them. No, all kinds of compromised motives exist behind biennales, but the people who make them cannot operate with compromised motives. And in fact, one of their principal tasks is to disentangle the compromises to the greatest extent possible in order that the viewer not hear all the noise in the background, but we actually have an experience of what is in the foreground. Now, I'm going to wind it up there and open it up to conversation, I hope, in fact, to dialogue, because I've done a lot of I'm talking and you're listening. But I'd like to just come back to Bakhtin. Bakhtin is a very interesting figure. He was a Russian literary critic in the Soviet period who developed an incredibly subtle way of saying dissenting things in a context where dissent was intolerable to power, but saying them in a sort of Aesopian way that were not immediately provocative, which meant he got to say more. And he developed this idea of literature as dialogue. That a novel is a dialogue, first and foremost, that the writer has with all of his or her alter egos, all of his or her different points of view. That whether they choose dialogue as a literary mode or whether they create characters that react and act in ways that stress these differences, that the work of art is not the conclusion one draws, but rather the process of not arriving at a conclusion, but of realizing, personifying, epitomizing all these ambiguities. Such that he wrote about Dostoevsky, a famous writer of ideas, as a writer who was, in a sense, in disagreement with himself perpetually and wrote novels about that. Even though he thought, that is to say, Dostoevsky, he'd solved all of his problems with Slavophile reactionary views, the truth of the matter, he was a welter of self-disagreement, and we read him because of that. That under those circumstances, a good reader is, in a sense, a good listener, not just a good, close reader of the page. But in any case, Bakhtin is an interesting figure because he's one of the very few theorists of all the theorists that are now popular who leaves the door wide open rather than trying to close it. And it may have something to do with the fact that many of the theorists that we have now are essentially trying to create new utopian models, new ways of solving everything, theoretically and then perhaps potentially in fact, wrapping it all up, the definitive total field theory, and solving it. There are, of course, artists and writers who say that's not what they're doing, but if you watch them closely, that is what they're doing. Bakhtin was one of the writers who kept things open as a matter of course, who devised a way of imagining literature as always a matter of dialogue, first, again, within the characters of the book and within the writer, but then, of course, within the people who, in his case, sat around tables with cigarettes and tea and debated what the book was about. One of the great Bakhtinian artists nowadays is Ilya Kabakov, the Russian artist, who creates characters and then creates installations around those characters. And some of the characters he creates are the interpreters of the other characters he creates. And the roles that he assigns to these characters are always to explode categories rather than to shut them down. Now, it is the sort of Bakhtinian model, which I think is one to be followed because it does precisely this. And in a recent book on Bakhtin that measured his influence over the past 100 years, I haven't given you all the images, but here are a bunch of people debating Louise Bourgeois, a 93-year-old contemporary. This is Nalini Malani, an artist from India who I think is also in this exhibition, although I have not yet seen her piece. An interesting dialogue between Nalini Malani and Sigmar Polke in terms of this kind of combination of imagery, also with Nancy Spiro. So you have a combination in this particular pavilion of an artist from Bombay, an artist from New York, and an artist from Dusseldorf, using imagery in ways which are related and all of them doing different things. It is their very similarities methodologically that produce a clear view of their differences actually as artists. This is a young person watching an old person die. This is Jenny Holzer, who made truisms about the commonplace ideas we have and their built-in ambiguities, and then who did this kind of work, which is about the disaster over which the United States is presiding in the Middle East. And I will just stop here since this is contemplative. This is Saul LeWitt. In any case, there was a writer named Michael Epstein writing in this book on Bakhtin who writes the following, and actually it's an interview. The concept of postmodernism is beginning to sound absurd. Instead of such a proliferation of posts, I would suggest defining the current epoch as proto, before the next. It is more appropriate to think that way as a definition of uncertainty rather than after the last. And if you look at all the theories, there is post this, post that, whatever it is, and if you then ask yourself the question, but what do we agree upon in the thing that then has this prefix, we understand finally that we don't agree on anything. So postmodernist is a meaningless term to the extent that nobody can agree on what modernism is. Now, I'm interested in these disagreements. I encourage them, as I've tried to say. I want the dialogue about them. But if we disagree about modernism, we should not say postmodernism and then nod our heads as if we finally got it right. And this is more or less what Epstein is saying. He goes on. Again, remember, this is a Russian writer in both cases. A Russian writer about a Russian writer. Epstein about Bakhtin. People who have gone through one of the great failed and, in fact, bloody failed experiences in creating a utopia. Utopians have taught us to fear the future. Have I misplaced the last of this quote? Okay. Utopians have taught us to fear the future, even though it is presented as an inevitable paradise. In order to overcome utopianism, it is not enough to be anti-utopian or even post-utopian. It is necessary to restore one's love of the future. And then, this is the part that I have lost, but I will paraphrase. He says, in other words, it is not to restore the promises of the state, but to restore a state of promise. I would leave you with that and say that this exhibition, in fact, it seems to me, is in some ways precisely about that. It evokes revolutions. It is mindful of their failures. It treats the next phase, the next turn of the wheel, as being something that perhaps is precisely a state of promise. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Talked about the death of the author and what it meant in terms of the reaction of the reader or the viewer and the larger role they had to play in participating in the interpretation of the work. But if you look back at the turn of the last century and the ready-made, was the death of the author a sort of consideration before Barthes? You know, those works were not authored in the way that they had been.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, an earlier form of this is Oscar Wilde, whom I cited. And his The Artist, a Critic is a Critic of Artists is in fact a postmodern essay which argues that, that the author, first of all, is unknowable, and second of all, not necessarily the most important factor, that is the reader, that is. So these are not new ideas. They get recreated in every generation. Lately, we've had a particularly doctrinaire reading of what is in fact an emancipatory text. That's the problem. And we've seen something else, the replacement of the author, meaning originator of a work of prose, with the commentator. So the author has been killed, up steps the commentator. Now the problem is, if you're trying to give power to the reader, you don't say, the author is dead, long live the author, and then say, but by the way, the reader has no rights because the commentator really does know better. That's the specialized reader, the professional reader. And that is, in fact, what we have seen a lot of.
Yeah, I agree completely.
I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the topic of Bill Henson, in terms of the wider context, do you see this as symbolic of a creeping moral conservatism that maybe is at the root of the demise of certain biennales overseas, that maybe we know that the high and mighty tend to see these as ways of bringing tourists into a particular city and attaching a little prestige to that city, and then if the economics don't stack up, gives them a perfect excuse if there's some kind of controversy, as in Bill Henson in this case, obviously not a part of the Biennale, to stick the knife in.
Well, I wouldn't step into the middle of Australian politics per se, but I know Bill Henson's work for a long time, and I think it's seriously important work. I would say that the moralists are always with us, whether they are empowered by people who have, the ability to empower them is another issue. And usually that occurs when the people who have that ability are actually weak themselves. And when they are trying to appease some part of their constituency that they think will add to what is in fact an unstable position. We had this in New York with Mayor Giuliani, who rose up in arms over a work by Chris O'Feely, the English artist, which was a Madonna, which was a Madonna who was black, which was a Madonna who was held off the floor by 2 mounds of elephant dung. Mr. Giuliani never saw the work. He saw it in a catalog brought to his attention by somebody. It sounds a little bit like what's happened in this case. And immediately got in front of the microphones and condemned it. That Chris O'Feely himself might be religious, that elephant dung might mean something in an African or Afro-Caribbean context, never occurred to Mr. Giuliani. In fact, it didn't matter much to him in any case. But in the end, Giuliani made a mess out of it, and it came back to haunt him because opportunistically he had leapt on this thing, and then the seriousness of the work and the fact that this artist had a real constituency beyond the so-called art world began to emerge. So these are, this is playing with fire politically. It is not an automatic thing that this will work well for you as a politician. And of course, it's terribly destructive of understandings of art, which could be greater. Now, let me just do another example. In the Biennale that I did, there was the work of Leon Ferrari. Let me see if I can get to it pretty quickly here. Here. The work of Leon Ferrari. The airplane is also in this exhibition. The rest of this work comes from a variety of times. And then I think the pertinent one is, no, it's not there. Sorry. The things on the walls, right here, are all front pages or inside feature pages of articles from the Vatican newspaper, on which have been collaged images of hell from the great tradition of Catholic religious imagery. And then relations between those images and the text in the articles are things like the debate over homosexuality within the church, debate over abortion within the church, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Plus, of course, there is a Christ being crucified to an American airplane. Elsewhere in the exhibition was other stuff of this nature. One of my favorites was some paintings by Y.Z. Kami, an Iranian artist, who painted a five-part series of paintings called Jerusalem, which represented the Ashkenazi and Sephardic rabbis of Jerusalem, the Greek or Eastern Orthodox and Catholic prelates of the Christian religion, and a Sunni imam. And it just said, Jerusalem. They were all based on a news photograph in which these men, who normally don't agree on very much, and whose constituencies are at war with each other in many cases, came together on the one thing they could agree on. And just guess, the one thing they could agree on was to ban a gay and lesbian march through Jerusalem. Unity arrived at by casting out somebody that you could all agree to cast out. Now, this was some of the work in my show. At a certain point, I got a call from the press and education offices simultaneously at the Biennale saying, would you be willing to meet with a large group of clergy, nuns and priests and some higher officials of the church, to talk to them about the exhibition? And I said, I'm not so sure. Do they want to really talk to me? I am an atheist to all intents and purposes. I respect religions, but I don't have one. I'm certainly not a Catholic, and I'm in a Catholic country, a predominantly Catholic country. Do they want to have this conversation? They said yes. I said, okay, if they really want it, then I'll go. So I went and I met with this very, very large group, and at the beginning of the conversation, I turned to the man who was a bishop who had organized the whole thing, and I said, I'm happy to do this, but do you really think we're going to get anywhere? Do you think that the people in this group will not react very negatively to some of the things that are here? And have you, what's your response? And he said, oh no, I've seen the exhibition 6 times. And in fact, we had a very interesting dialogue back and forth. They didn't say all of what they felt and thought, and I didn't say all of what I felt and thought. But the very fact that we had a work of art between us that put pressure on all of the actual serious issues that existed but go unspoken was the sort of basis to have an exchange that would otherwise not have happened. And I think, again, this is how, under the best circumstances, controversial art like Bill Henson's, which is not that controversial, but relatively speaking, controversial work, is the occasion to have the conversation about where the disagreements lie, rather than the occasion to stop that conversation cold based on some kind of prejudicial exploitation of the laws.